The coffee cup slipped from my trembling fingers, hot liquid spreading across the mahogany desk as I stared at the document that would change everything. My name, Chloe Patterson, was typed in bold letters across the top of a psychiatric evaluation I'd never consented to, declaring me mentally incompetent and unfit to manage my own affairs. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Vincent Cross, a man I'd met exactly once, during what I thought was a routine family therapy session my parents had insisted on. The date was 3 weeks ago. The recommendations were devastating. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what made my blood run cold. The letterhead was fake. I knew because my husband Marcus had shown me what real psychiatric documentation looked like, hundreds of times. Dr. Marcus Hartwell wasn't just any psychiatrist, he was one of the most respected mental health professionals in Portland, and he'd been sitting right beside me when I found this document, his face growing paler with each line we read together. "They're trying to have you declared incompetent," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain pattering against our Pearl District loft windows. "Chloe, if this goes through, they can take control of everything. Your inheritance, your decisions, your freedom." The room started spinning. My own parents had orchestrated this elaborate deception, hiring a fake doctor to destroy my credibility, all because I'd started asking questions about the missing money from my grandmother's estate. Questions that apparently threatened their carefully constructed lie. The morning everything began to unravel started like any other Tuesday in October. I was rushing through the corridors of Oregon Medical Center, where I worked as a trauma nurse, my scrubs still damp from the Seattle rain that had followed me down the coast during my weekend visit to see my college roommate. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting that familiar hospital pallor over everything as I grabbed my assignment sheet and coffee in one fluid motion. I loved my job, loved the controlled chaos of the emergency department, the way each shift brought new challenges that required split-second decisions and unwavering focus. After growing up in the suffocating atmosphere of my family's real estate empire, where every conversation felt scripted and every emotion measured for maximum impact, the raw honesty of medical emergencies felt like breathing fresh air. My phone buzzed as I was checking on Miss Chen, an elderly woman who'd come in with chest pains that turned out to be anxiety-induced. The text was from my mother, Diane Patterson, written in her characteristically clipped tone. "Family dinner tonight, 7 sharp, important business to discuss. Dress appropriately." I sighed, knowing that important business in my family usually meant another attempt to pull me deeper into Patterson real estate, the multi-million-dollar company my grandfather had built from nothing, and my parents had spent the last 20 years expanding across the Pacific Northwest. Ever since my grandmother Rose had passed away 6 months ago, leaving me a substantial inheritance, these family dinners had become increasingly frequent and increasingly tense. Marcus found me in the break room during my lunch hour, unwrapping a sandwich with the mechanical precision of someone who'd eaten the same meal for 3 weeks straight. He slid into the plastic chair across from me, his dark hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it, a habit he'd developed whenever he was processing something difficult from his therapy sessions. "How was group therapy this morning?" I asked, genuinely interested. Marcus specialized in treating trauma survivors, and his dedication to his patients never ceased to amaze me. We'd met 2 years ago when I'd brought a young car accident victim to his unit, and his gentle manner with the frightened teenager had caught my attention immediately. "Challenging," he said, which was his standard response when patient confidentiality prevented him from sharing details. "But I've been thinking about what you told me last week, about the discrepancies in your grandmother's estate papers." I paused mid-bite. Over the past month I'd been trying to understand the complex financial documents related to my inheritance, and several things hadn't added up. Large withdrawals had been made from my grandmother's accounts in the months before her death, transfers that my parents claimed were for her medical care, but the amounts seemed astronomical for someone who'd been relatively healthy until her final week. "I've been wondering if I should ask to see the medical bills," I said quietly, "but every time I bring it up, my parents get defensive and change the subject." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Chloe, I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you'll stay calm. His voice carried a weight I'd rarely heard before. Yesterday, when you were at work, a man came to my private practice asking questions about you. The sandwich turned to cardboard in my mouth. What kind of questions? He introduced himself as Vincent Cross and said he was conducting a routine psychological evaluation for your family's insurance purposes. He wanted to know about your mental health history, whether you'd exhibited any signs of instability or poor judgment. Marcus's jaw tightened. I told him that I don't discuss my wife with strangers and asked to see his credentials. And he gave me some excuse about forgetting his identification and left quickly. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. Chloe, I've never heard of any Vincent Cross in the Portland psychiatric community, and I know everyone. This felt wrong. A chill ran down my spine despite the overheated break room. Why would someone be asking about my mental health? I don't know, but I think tonight's dinner might give us some answers. The Patterson family estate in Westfield Heights had always felt more like a museum than a home. My parents had purchased the Tudor-style mansion 15 years ago when their real estate business began generating serious money, and my mother had spent a fortune decorating it with antiques and artwork that impressed clients but made family gatherings feel like formal exhibitions. Marcus and I arrived precisely at 7, as commanded. My father Richard answered the door, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his handshake firm enough to remind everyone that he'd once played college football. Behind him, my mother appeared in a navy dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, her smile bright and brittle as ceramic. Chloe, darling, you look tired, she said, which was her way of saying I looked terrible. And Marcus, thank you for joining us. We have so much to discuss. My younger sister Natalie was already seated in the formal dining room, scrolling through her phone with the practiced boredom of someone who'd attended too many of these mandatory family meetings. At 24, she'd embraced her role as the Patterson princess, working part-time at the real estate office while spending most of her energy planning her upcoming wedding to a lawyer whose family owned half the waterfront property in Oregon. My brother Tyler arrived 10 minutes late, as usual, still wearing his construction clothes from the job site where he worked as a project manager. At 28, he was the only one of us who'd tried to build something independent of the family business, though my parents never let him forget that his construction company's startup loan had come from Patterson Real Estate. Now that we're all here, my father began, settling into his chair at the head of the polished oak table, we need to address some concerning developments regarding Rose's estate. I felt Marcus tense beside me. What kind of developments? My mother's smile never wavered. Well, there have been some irregularities in how the inheritance funds are being managed. Nothing serious, of course, but our accountant recommended that we establish a family trust to ensure everything is handled properly. What kind of irregularity? I asked, my nursing instincts kicking in. In the ER, when people spoke in vague terms about concerning developments, it usually meant they were hiding something critical. Oh, just some paperwork discrepancies, my father said with a wave of his hand. The important thing is that we're taking steps to protect everyone's interests. Tyler looked up from his plate of my mother's signature pot roast. What does this have to do with me? I'm not inheriting anything. It affects all of us, Natalie said without looking up from her phone. If there are problems with grandmother's estate, it could impact the family business. Something cold settled in my stomach. How exactly would my inheritance impact Patterson Real Estate? The room fell silent except for the soft jazz music my mother always played during dinner. My parents exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction too long. We're simply being cautious, my mother said finally, which is why we've arranged for you to meet with a specialist who can help us understand the best way forward. What kind of specialist? A psychiatrist, my father said. Dr. Vincent Cross comes highly recommended. He specializes in helping families navigate complex financial decisions during times of grief and transition. Marcus's fork clattered against his plate. I'm sorry, did you say Dr. Vincent Cross? Yes. Do you know him? My mother asked, her voice carefully neutral. I've heard the name, Marcus said slowly. I could feel the tension radiating from him. "When is this appointment supposed to take place?" "Actually," my father said, checking his gold watch. "He should be arriving any moment. We thought it would be more comfortable to meet here in a familiar environment." The doorbell rang before I could respond, its melodic chime echoing through the house like a funeral dirge. My mother rose gracefully. "That must be Dr. Cross now." I watched her glide toward the front door, my mind racing. This felt like an ambush, a carefully orchestrated performance where everyone knew their lines except me. Marcus reached under the table and squeezed my hand, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. Vincent Cross was exactly what central casting would order for a distinguished psychiatrist, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen important meetings. He entered the dining room with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Miss Patterson," he said, extending his hand toward me. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "I wasn't aware I had agreed to anything," I replied, not taking his hand. His smile never faltered. "Of course, your parents explained that you've been experiencing some stress related to your recent inheritance. They're concerned about your well-being." "My well-being is fine," I said flatly. "I'm sure it is," he said, settling into the chair my father indicated. "But grief can manifest in unexpected ways. Sometimes people make decisions during emotional periods that they later regret." Marcus cleared his throat. "Dr. Cross, could you tell us about your background? Where did you complete your residence?" For just a moment, something flickered across the man's face. "Johns Hopkins," he said smoothly, "though I've been in private practice for many years now." "And your license number?" Marcus pressed. "I'm sorry? Your state license number." It's standard for psychiatrists to provide that information when conducting evaluations. Dr. Cross reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card. "Of course, all my credentials are listed there." Marcus studied the card, his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you. Now then," Cross continued, turning his attention back to me, "your parents have mentioned that you've been asking a lot of questions about your grandmother's finances. Can you tell me about that?" The way he phrased it made my perfectly reasonable inquiries sound like symptoms of paranoia. "I'm trying to understand the estate documents. Some of the numbers don't make sense." "What kind of numbers?" I looked around the table at my family's expectant faces. This felt like a trial where I hadn't been told what I was accused of. "Large withdrawals that supposedly went to medical expenses, but the amounts are much higher than what Medicare and her supplemental insurance wouldn't have covered." "I see," Dr. Cross said, making notes on a yellow pad. "And how does this make you feel?" "Confused," I said honestly, "and concerned that someone might have taken advantage of an elderly woman." My mother's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. "Chloe, how can you say such a thing?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," I said quickly. "I just want to understand what happened to the money." "This is exactly what we're worried about," my father said to Dr. Cross. "She's become obsessed with these financial details, seeing conspiracy where there are simple explanations." "Obsessed?" The word hit me like a slap. "I'm asking reasonable questions about my inheritance." "Chloe," Dr. Cross said in the gentle tone therapists use with agitated patients, "it's natural to want to understand your grandmother's final wishes, but sometimes grief can distort our perception of events. Has anyone else expressed concerns about these financial discrepancies?" I hesitated. The truth was, I hadn't discussed the details with anyone except Marcus, and he'd encouraged me to investigate further. But suddenly that felt like admitting weakness. "She's been having trouble sleeping," my mother added helpfully, "and she's been withdrawn at work. Her supervisor called me last week expressing concern." That was a complete lie. My charge nurse had never called my parents about anything. But before I could object, Dr. Cross was nodding sympathetically and making more notes. "Sleep disturbances and social withdrawal can indeed be signs of depression or anxiety," he said. "Have you considered that these financial concerns might be manifestations of deeper psychological issues?" "No," I said firmly, "because they're not psychological issues. They're mathematical discrepancies." "Of course," he said, in that same patronizing tone. Would you be willing to undergo a brief psychological evaluation, just to establish a baseline for your mental health as you navigate this difficult period? Every instinct I'd developed as a trauma nurse was screaming warnings. Patients who were rushed into procedures without proper explanation usually had something seriously wrong that someone was trying to hide. What kind of evaluation? Nothing invasive. A few standard questionnaires, some simple cognitive tests. It would give us objective data to work with. Marcus spoke up. Dr. Cross, what's your specific area of expertise within psychiatry? Again, that slight hesitation. I work primarily with family dynamics and inheritance-related stress. That's interesting, Marcus said. I've never heard of inheritance-related stress as a psychiatric subspecialty. Is that a new field? Every family situation is unique, Dr. Cross replied smoothly. Now, Miss Patterson, shall we proceed with the evaluation? I looked around the table again. My parents were watching me with the intensity of hawks circling prey. Natalie was still pretending to scroll through her phone, but I could see her eyes tracking the conversation. Tyler looked uncomfortable but hadn't said a word in my defense. I think I'd prefer to discuss this with my own healthcare provider first, I said. Chloe, my mother said sharply, Dr. Cross has graciously agreed to come here tonight as a favor to the family. Don't be rude. I'm not being rude. I'm being careful. See, my father said to Dr. Cross. This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking we're concerned about. The word paranoid hung in the air like poison gas. In that moment, I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a family dinner or a casual consultation. This was a setup, designed to create a paper trail that would support whatever my parents had already decided about my mental state. I think we should go, I said to Marcus, standing abrupt. Chloe, sit down, my mother commanded in the voice she'd used when I was 8 years old and misbehaving in church. No, I said, I'm a grown woman, and I'm leaving. Dr. Cross made another note on his pad. Flight response and defiance of authority figures, he murmured, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Marcus stood as well, his hand finding my elbow. Thank you for dinner, he said politely to my parents. We'll be in touch. Marcus, my father said, surely you can see that Chloe needs help. The only thing I can see, Marcus replied, his voice deadly calm, is that this entire evening has been a performance designed to manipulate my wife. We walked to the door in silence, the weight of 5 pairs of eyes boring into our backs. As we reached the foyer, Dr. Cross called out behind us, Miss Patterson, I'll be filing my preliminary report with your family's attorney tomorrow. I hope you'll reconsider allowing me to complete a proper evaluation. I turned back to face him, this stranger who was threatening to destroy my life with lies typed on official letterhead. What preliminary report? You haven't evaluated me. On the contrary, he said, consulting his notes. I've observed significant signs of paranoid ideation, defiance of authority, sleep disturbances, and social withdrawal. These are all consistent with a psychological break triggered by grief and financial stress. The room started spinning. He was going to write a report recommending that I be declared mentally incompetent, based on a dinner conversation, where I'd asked reasonable questions and refused to submit to his fake evaluation. You can't do that, I whispered. I'm afraid I can, he said gently, and I'm afraid I must. Your family is genuinely concerned about your welfare. Marcus's hand tightened on my arm. We're leaving. Now. The October air felt like ice water after the overheated house. Marcus didn't speak until we were in his car, driving through the tree-lined streets of Westfield Heights, where every mansion hid its own secrets behind perfectly manicured lawns. They're going to try to have you declared incompetent, he said finally. Can they do that? If they have a psychiatrist willing to file a report claiming you're mentally unstable, yes, they can petition the court to appoint a conservator to manage your affairs. But he's not a real psychiatrist. We'll have to prove that. I stared out the window at the houses streaming past, each one representing a family that probably had its own version of normal dysfunction. Why would they do this to me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. How much money are we talking about, with your grandmother's inheritance? $2.7 million. He whistled softly. That's a lot of money, but it's my money. Grandmother left it specifically to me. Unless you're declared incompetent to manage it, Then it would go into a trust controlled by your family. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. My parents hadn't just hired a fake psychiatrist to evaluate me, they'd hired him to manufacture evidence that I was mentally unfit, giving them legal control over my inheritance. The money that my grandmother had specifically left to me, probably because she'd seen through their careful facade to the manipulative people underneath. What do we do? I asked. Marcus pulled into the parking garage of our building and turned off the engine. In the silence, I could hear the distant sound of traffic and the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. We fight back, he said, but we have to be smart about it. If they're willing to go this far, they won't hesitate to escalate further. How do we fight back against a lie? We expose it, he said, and we document everything they do from now on. As we rode the elevator up to our floor, I felt like I was seeing my life from the outside for the first time. The loving family that had raised me, supported my education, celebrated my achievements, was willing to destroy my reputation and steal my inheritance to protect their own interests. The realization was so fundamentally jarring that it felt like discovering that gravity worked backward. Our loft felt like a sanctuary after the toxic atmosphere of my parents' house. Marcus immediately went to his home office and pulled out a thick directory of mental health professionals in Oregon. Dr. Vincent Cross, he said, running his finger down the listings. Vincent Cross, Vincent Cross. He looked up. He's not here. Maybe he's from out of state. Marcus was already at his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard. Let me check the national databases. After several minutes, he shook his head. There's no licensed psychiatrist named Vincent Cross anywhere in the United States. So he's definitely fake, definitely fake. But that doesn't mean the report he files won't have consequences. If your parents submit it to a court, even a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation can trigger legal proceedings that take months to resolve. I sank onto our couch, the enormity of the situation finally hitting me. They're really going to do this. They're going to try to have me declared insane to steal my inheritance. Marcus sat beside me and pulled me against his chest. They're going to try, he said. But we're not going to let them succeed. How can you be so sure? Because, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination, I know something they don't know. What? I know what real psychiatric documentation looks like. I know what genuine mental health evaluations involve. And I know how to gather evidence that will expose their fraud. I looked up at him, this man I'd married because he made me laugh and held me when I cried, and never tried to change me into someone more convenient. You'd risk your career to help me, Chloe, he said, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. They're not just attacking your sanity. They're attacking your right to exist as an independent person. This isn't about money anymore. This is about whether you get to live your own life. Outside our windows, Portland sparkled in the darkness, millions of people living their own complicated lives, most of them blissfully unaware that families could be weapons turned against the people who were supposed to love you most. But inside our small space, surrounded by the books and artwork and comfortable chaos that we'd built together, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. My parents had made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed that Marcus would either support their version of events, or remain neutral to avoid conflict. They hadn't counted on the fact that my husband was not only a genuine expert in the field they were trying to fake, but someone who loved me enough to put everything on the line to protect me. What's our first step? I asked. Marcus smiled, and for the first time all evening, it wasn't grim or worried. It was the smile of someone who'd just realized he was holding better cards than his opponents knew. Tomorrow, he said, we start building a case that will destroy them. The morning after the dinner from hell, I woke to find Marcus already dressed and pacing our bedroom, his phone pressed to his ear. Through the gauze of half-sleep, I caught fragments of his conversation with someone named.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rodriguez. Something about emergency consultation and fraudulent documentation. The clock on my nightstand glowed 6:47 a.m., and pale October sunlight filtered through our blinds like judgment. Lena, I need you to understand the severity of this situation, Marcus was saying. his voice carrying the controlled urgency he used when discussing critical patient care. "They've manufactured a psychological evaluation designed to support an incompetency petition." "Yes. I'm certain he's not licensed. I checked every database we have access to." I sat up, my mind immediately snapping to attention despite the early hour. In the ER, we learned to go from dead sleep to full alertness in seconds, and right now, every instinct was telling me we were in crisis mode. Marcus noticed I was awake and mouthed Dr. Rodriguez while pointing to his phone. Lena Rodriguez was the chief of psychiatry at Oregon Medical Center, a woman whose reputation for integrity was matched only by her intolerance for professional misconduct. If Marcus was calling her at dawn, the situation was even worse than I'd realized. "Can you meet us at the hospital this morning? I want to show you what we're dealing with before this escalates further." Marcus paused, listening. "Thank you, Elena. We'll be there in an hour." He hung up and turned to me, his expression grim but determined. "Dr. Rodriguez is going to help us document the legitimate standards for psychiatric evaluation. If your parents try to use Cross's fake report in court, we'll have expert testimony ready to tear it apart." "What did you tell her?" "That a colleague's family member is being targeted by someone impersonating a mental health professional. I didn't mention your name or that you're my wife. Lena doesn't need those complications clouding her professional judgment." I appreciated his discretion, but the secrecy felt ominous. "Are we sure we can trust her?" Lena Rodriguez has spent her entire career fighting for patient rights and professional ethics. If there's anyone in this city who'll stand up to fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, it's her. We dressed quickly and drove through Portland's morning traffic in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The city looked different somehow, as if learning that my family was willing to destroy my sanity for money had shifted my perception of everything around me. The homeless camps under the interstate overpasses, the expensive coffee shops with their carefully curated authenticity, the sleek medical center where I'd spent the last 3 years saving lives. It all felt like a stage set where everyone was performing their assigned roles except me. Oregon Medical Center at 7 in the morning buzzed with the controlled chaos I'd grown to love. The overnight trauma cases were being handed off to day shift, residents were gulping coffee and reviewing charts, and the familiar smell of disinfectant and institutional coffee created a backdrop that felt more like home than my childhood house ever had. Rodriguez met us in her office on the 8th floor, a space that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. Lena was a small woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd immigrated from Guatemala as a child and worked her way through medical school with a determination that had become legendary among the staff. "Marcus," she said, embracing him warmly before turning to me, "and you must be the colleague whose family member is in trouble." I felt Marcus tense slightly beside me. We'd agreed to keep my identity vague, but Elena's sharp gaze suggested she was already connecting dots we'd hoped to keep separate. "Thank you for meeting with us so early," I said. "I know this is unusual." "Unusual doesn't begin to cover it," Elena replied, settling behind her desk. "Marcus told me someone is impersonating a psychiatrist to conduct fraudulent evaluations. That's not just unethical, it's criminal." Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his voice recording app. "Do you mind if I record this conversation? I want to make sure we have accurate documentation of everything." "Of course." Elena's expression sharpened. "Now tell me exactly what happened." I recounted the previous evening's events, carefully describing Dr. Cross's behavior, his questions and his threat to file a preliminary report. Elena's face grew darker with each detail. "Let me understand this correctly," she said when I finished. "This man conducted no formal assessment, administered no standardized tests, and observed you for perhaps 30 minutes in a family setting. Yet he claims to have identified signs of paranoid ideation and psychological instability." "That's exactly what he said." Lena shook her head, in disgust. "That's not just fraudulent, it's insulting to every legitimate mental health professional. A proper psychological evaluation requires hours of testing, review of medical history, collateral information from multiple sources, and standardized assessment tool. You can't diagnose someone over pot roast. What kind of legal consequences could this fake report have? Marcus asked. If it's submitted to a court as part of an incompetency petition, it could trigger a cascade of legal proceedings. Even when the fraud is eventually exposed, the process can take months or years to resolve. In the meantime, the subject's rights can be severely restricted. The weight of Elena's words settled over me like a lead blanket. My parents weren't just threatening my inheritance. They were threatening my fundamental right to make my own decisions about my life. What would a legitimate evaluation look like? I asked. Elena pulled out a thick binder from her bookshelf. A comprehensive psychological assessment typically includes clinical interviews, standardized tests, like the MMPI-2, cognitive assessments, review of medical and psychiatric history, and interviews with collateral sources who know the patient well. The entire process usually takes 8 to 12 hours, spread over multiple sessions. She flipped through pages of forms and charts. The evaluator must be licensed in the state where the assessment occurs, must use scientifically validated instruments, and must document their methodology extensively. Most importantly, the patient must provide informed consent for the evaluation. None of that happened. I said. Because none of it can happen in a dinner conversation, Elena replied firmly. What this Dr. Cross did wasn't just inadequate, it was impossible. Marcus leaned forward. Elena, if we needed to challenge this fake evaluation in court, what kind of expert testimony would be most effective? A board-certified psychiatrist who can explain the standards of practice for psychological evaluation. Someone who can detail exactly how this supposed assessment deviated from accepted protocols. She paused, studying Marcus's face. Someone like me, would you be willing to testify if it means stopping someone from impersonating a mental health professional and potentially destroying an innocent person's life? Absolutely. Relief flooded through me so suddenly I felt lightheaded. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. Elena's expression softened. Actually, I think I do. I've seen what happens when families weaponize mental health diagnoses. It's one of the most insidious forms of abuse, because it attacks the victim's credibility and autonomy simultaneously. We spent the next hour reviewing Elena's documentation standards and recording her detailed explanation of proper evaluation procedures. By the time we left her office, we had over 90 minutes of expert testimony that would demolish any attempt to use Cross's fake report in legal proceedings. But as we walked back to the parking garage, I realized we were still playing defense. My parents had the advantage of being able to act first, filing their fraudulent petition and forcing us to respond. We needed to shift to offense. Marcus, I said as we reached his car, I want to know everything about my grandmother's financial records, not just the inheritance documents, but her medical bills, her bank statements, everything. That could be difficult to obtain. Your parents probably have control of most of those records. Then we need to find another way. Grandmother had to have other people in her life. Doctors, lawyers, accountants, someone who might have copies or records. Marcus started the engine, but didn't put the car in gear. Chloe, if we start digging into the financial irregularities, we're essentially accusing your parents of elder abuse or fraud. That's a serious allegation. They accused me of being mentally incompetent. I'd say we're past worrying about serious allegations. He nodded slowly. You're right. Where do we start? With grandmother's lawyer. Robert Morrison handled her estate planning for 20 years. If anyone knows where the money went, it's him. Morrison and Associates occupied a converted Victorian house in northwest Portland, the kind of law office that specialized in old families and older money. Robert Morrison himself was pushing 70, with white hair and the deliberate movements of someone who'd learned that careful consideration prevented costly mistakes. His secretary, a woman who looked like she'd been guarding his calendar since the Carter administration, initially tried to dismiss us with polite deflection, but when I mentioned Rose Patterson's estate and showed my identification, her demeanor shifted. Miss Morrison has been expecting someone from the family to contact him, she said carefully. There have been some questions about the estate administration. Questions. The word hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Robert Morrison's office was lined with law books and family photographs spanning decades of Portland history. He rose from behind a massive oak desk when we entered, his handshake firm but his eyes troubled. "Miss Patterson," he said, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I need to ask you about some irregularities in grandmother's financial records before her death." His expression grew guarded. "What kind of irregularity?" "Large withdrawals from her accounts that supposedly went to medical expenses. The amounts seem excessive for someone with comprehensive insurance coverage." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk blotter. "Miss Patterson, I need to be very careful about what I can discuss with you. Attorney-client privilege extends beyond death, and there are ongoing confidentiality concerns." "Mr. Morrison," Marcus interjected, "we have reason to believe that irregularities in Miss Patterson's financial records are being used to question Chloe's mental competency. If there's information that could help protect her from fraudulent legal proceedings, wouldn't that be in the deceased's best interests?" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Someone is questioning your mental competence." "On what grounds?" I explained the previous night's encounter with Dr. Cross, Morrison's expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was silent for several minutes, clearly weighing his professional obligations against his personal convictions. "Miss Patterson," he said finally, "I cannot violate attorney-client privilege by discussing your grandmother's private communications with me. However, I can tell you that public records show significant discrepancies between the medical expenses claimed by your parents and the actual bills submitted to Medicare and your grandmother's supplemental insurance." "How significant?" "Over $400,000 in claimed expenses that don't correspond to any documented medical care." The number hit me like a physical blow. $400,000. Nearly 20% of my inheritance, taken from my grandmother's accounts for medical care that apparently never existed. "Where did the money go?" I asked. "I can't tell you that, but I can tell you that your grandmother expressed concerns about her financial affairs in the months before her death. She asked me to review certain transactions and requested that her will be modified to ensure maximum protection for her primary beneficiary." "The primary beneficiary being..." "Yes, she was very specific about wanting to ensure that her wishes would be honored exactly as written, regardless of any family objections or complications that might arise." Marcus leaned forward. "Miss Morrison, if someone were to challenge Chloe's competency to inherit, what protections exist?" Your grandmother anticipated that possibility. The will includes specific language requiring any competency challenges to be evaluated by a panel of 3 independent medical professionals, none of whom can have any financial interest in the estate or prior relationship with the family. Relief washed over me. Even in death, my grandmother had been protecting me from exactly what my parents were trying to do. However, Morrison continued, that protection only applies to challenges made after the inheritance is distributed. If someone obtained a conservatorship order before the estate is settled, they could potentially block the distribution entirely. How long does estate settlement typically take? Under normal circumstances, 3 to 6 months. But if there are legal challenges or investigations into the estate administration, it could take years. The pieces of my parents' strategy were becoming clear. They didn't need to permanently destroy my reputation. They just needed to delay my inheritance long enough to hide the evidence of their theft. A conservatorship based on fraudulent psychiatric evaluation could tie up the estate indefinitely while they covered their tracks. "Miss Morrison," I said, "is there anything you can do to expedite the settlement process?" "I can file a motion to accelerate, but only if there's evidence of urgency or potential harm to the beneficiary." He studied my face carefully. Being targeted by fraudulent psychiatric evaluation might qualify as potential harm. We left Morrison's office with more questions than answers, but at least now we understood the scope of what we were fighting. My parents had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from my grandmother and were using fake psychiatric evaluation to prevent me from exposing their theft. The drive back to our apartment was quiet, both of us processing the magnitude of what we'd learned. $400,000 wasn't just missing money, it was a motive for destroying someone's life to cover up a crime. "We need more evidence," Marcus said as we pulled into our building's garage. Morrison gave us enough to understand what happened, but not enough to prove it. What kind of evidence? Documentation of the fraudulent medical expenses, records showing where the money actually went, and most importantly, proof that your parents orchestrated the fake psychiatric evaluation. How do we get proof of that? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. We rode the elevator up to our floor in silence. Inside our apartment, Marcus went straight to his office and pulled out a small device I'd never seen before. What is that? A digital voice recorder? Professional grade, the kind we use for patient sessions. He held it up, examining it from different angles. If we can get your parents to admit what they're doing, on tape, we'd have everything we need. You want me to record my own family? I want you to protect yourself. Chloe, they're not acting like family anymore. They're acting like criminals who see you as a threat to their freedom. The truth of his words hit me like cold water. My parents weren't just trying to steal my inheritance. They were trying to destroy my credibility, so thoroughly that no one would believe me if I exposed their crime. They'd crossed a line that transformed them from manipulative relatives into active enemies. How would we do it? You call your mother, tell her you've been thinking about last night, and maybe you overreacted. Suggest meeting for coffee to discuss the situation calmly, record everything. What if they don't admit anything? Then we try something else. But Chloe, people who commit crimes usually can't resist justifying their actions when they think they're safe. If your parents believe they've successfully isolated and discredited you, they might be willing to explain why they had no choice but to save you from yourself. I stared at the recorder, this small device that could either save my life or destroy what remained of my relationship with my family. But then I remembered Dr. Cross's condescending smile, and his threat to file a report declaring me mentally incompetent, and I realized that relationship was already destroyed. Okay, I said, let's do it. Marcus showed me how to operate the recorder, how to hide it in my purse so it would pick up conversation without being detected. We practiced different scenarios, ways to steer conversation toward admissions without being obvious about it. Remember, he said, you're not trying to trap them in lies. You're giving them an opportunity to tell you the truth. Let them think they're convincing you to see things their way. I called my mother at noon, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but hopeful. Chloe, darling, I was hoping you'd call. Hi, Mom, I've been thinking about last night, and I think maybe I overreacted. Oh, sweetheart, I'm so glad you're calling. We were so worried about you. I know you. I was wondering if we could meet for coffee this afternoon, just the two of us. I think there are some things we need to discuss. Of course, darling. How about Moonbeam Cafe on Burnside, 2 o'clock? That sounds perfect. Mom, yes? I'm sorry I got so upset last night. I know you and Dad are just trying to help. We love you, Chloe. We only want what's best for you. After I hung up, Marcus pulled me into his arms. You did great. Just remember, whatever they say, whatever they try to convince you of, you know the truth. Don't let them make you doubt your own perceptions. What if I'm wrong? What if there really is a reasonable explanation for everything? Marcus held me tighter. Then we'll deal with that. But Chloe, reasonable explanations don't require fake psychiatrists and threats of conservatorship. Whatever your parents are hiding, it's serious enough to risk destroying your life to protect it. I spent the hour before our meeting pacing our apartment, running through possible conversations in my mind. The voice recorder felt like a weight in my purse, a constant reminder that I was about to cross a line that would fundamentally change my relationship with my mother forever. But as I walked into Moonbeam Cafe at 5 minutes before 2, I reminded myself that my mother had already crossed that line. She'd hired a fake doctor to have me declared insane. Whatever happened next, she'd made the choice to treat me as an enemy rather than a daughter. The afternoon sun streamed through the cafe's large windows, casting everything in golden light that should have felt warm and welcoming. Instead, it felt like stage lighting for a performance where I didn't know my line. My mother was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of pastries she'd ordered for us to share. She stood and hugged me when I approached, her embrace feeling both familiar and foreign. You look better today, she said as we sat down. More rest. I feel better. I think I just needed some time to process everything. Of course you did. These kinds of family discussions can be overwhelming. especially when you're already dealing with grief over your grandmother. I sipped my coffee and let her talk, watching her face as she explained how worried she and my father had been about my behavior lately. She spoke with the practiced ease of someone who'd rehearsed her justifications, each word carefully chosen to sound reasonable and loving. Cross was very understanding about your reaction last night, she continued. He said that resistance to evaluation is actually quite common in people who are experiencing psychological distress. What exactly did Dr. Cross tell you about my psychological distress? Well, he explained that grief can manifest in many ways. Sometimes people become fixated on financial details as a way of avoiding the emotional reality of their loss. The mind creates mysteries to solve, because solving puzzles feels more manageable than accepting that someone we love is gone. It was a plausible-sounding explanation, the kind of pop psychology that would convince someone who didn't understand how real psychiatric evaluation worked. But it also revealed how much thought my parents had put into constructing a narrative that painted my perfectly reasonable questions as symptoms of mental illness. That actually makes sense, I said carefully. I have been thinking about grandmother's finances a lot lately. Exactly. And that's why Dr. Cross thinks a formal evaluation would be so helpful, not to declare you incompetent, sweetheart, but to help you work through the grief in a healthy way. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Those medical expenses from grandmother's last few months, they seemed really high. Even with her insurance, $400,000 seems like a lot. My mother's coffee cup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. Where did you get that number? I was looking at the estate documents. It just seemed like more than I expected for someone who was relatively healthy until the end. Chloe, your grandmother was sicker than we let you know. We didn't want to burden you with all the details while you were so busy with work. What kind of details? My mother glanced around the cafe as if checking to make sure no one was listening. She was developing dementia, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but a slow cognitive decline that affected her judgment. Toward the end, she was becoming paranoid about money, convinced that people were trying to steal from her. The irony of my mother accusing my grandmother of paranoia about theft was so blatant it took my breath away, but I forced myself to maintain an expression of concerned confusion. I had no idea. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because we knew how much you loved her and we didn't want you to remember her that way. But Chloe, some of the financial irregularities you're worried about were actually necessary interventions to protect her from herself. What do you mean? She was making erratic financial decisions, talking about changing her will, giving money to strangers, even accusing your father and me of stealing from her. We had to take steps to prevent her from being victimized by scam artists, or making choices she'd regret. I felt sick to my stomach. My mother was describing exactly what she and my father were doing to me, taking control of someone's finances while claiming it was for their own protection. The projection was so complete it was almost admirable in its audacity. So the $400,000 went to protecting her. It went to specialized care and legal protections that her regular insurance didn't cover: private nurses, security consultations, legal fees for estate protection. It was expensive, but necessary. I see. And Dr. Cross thinks I might be developing similar paranoid tendencies. Not paranoid, sweetheart, just fixated. Grief can make us see patterns that aren't really there. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. Chloe, I need you to understand something. Your father and I love you more than anything in the world. If we thought there was any chance you were truly mentally ill, we'd move heaven and earth to get you the best treatment available. But we don't think you're sick. We think you're hurting, and we want to help you heal. It was a masterful performance, combining just enough truth with carefully crafted lies to create a narrative that would sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know the full context.
If I hadn't already discovered that Dr. Cross was fraudulent, if I hadn't seen the legal protections my grandmother had built into her will, I might have been convinced. What would happen if Dr. Cross's evaluation recommended that I need help managing my affairs? Then we'd make sure you got that help. A conservatorship isn't a punishment, Chloe, it's a safety net. Someone who loves you would handle the complicated financial decisions while you focus on healing. Someone like you and Dad? If that's what the court decided was best for you, yes, there it was. The admission that they were seeking control over my inheritance disguised as concern for my well-being.
I felt the voice recorder in my purse like a talisman, capturing every word of my mother's careful justification. Mom, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course. Is Dr. Cross a real psychiatrist? For just a moment, my mother's composed expression faltered. It was barely a flicker, but I saw the calculation behind her eyes as she decided how to respond. What do you mean by real? I mean, is he licensed to practice psychiatry in Oregon? Chloe, why are you asking these questions? Are you having doubts about getting the help you need? I'm just trying to understand the situation. It's important to me that any evaluation be conducted by qualified professionals. Dr. Cross is extremely qualified. He's helped many families navigate difficult situations like ours. But is he licensed in Oregon? My mother sighed, the sound of someone being forced to reveal information she'd preferred to keep hidden. Dr. Cross operates under a different model than traditional psychiatrists. He specializes in family consultation and intervention. His approach is more holistic, less focused on rigid diagnostic categories. Mom, that's not an answer. Is he licensed or not? Licensing is just bureaucratic red tape, Chloe. What matters is results. Dr. Cross has helped numerous families resolve complex psychological and financial issues by having people declared mentally incompetent, by helping families find solutions that protect everyone's interests. The mask was slipping now. My mother was no longer pretending that Dr. Cross was conducting a genuine psychological evaluation. She was describing him as someone who provided a service, manufacturing psychiatric opinions that supported predetermined outcomes. How many families has he helped this way? I don't have specific numbers, but your father's business attorney recommended him highly. Apparently, Dr. Cross worked with several other families who faced similar challenges with inheritance-related disputes. Other families who needed relatives declared incompetent to manage large inheritances. My mother's face tightened. Chloe, you're twisting this into something ugly when it's really about protecting people who aren't capable of protecting themselves. But I am capable of protecting myself. I'm a trauma nurse. I make life and death decisions every day. I manage my own finances, my own career, my own marriage. What exactly do I need protection from? From making decisions based on grief and paranoia instead of clear thinking, such as accusing your own family of stealing from your grandmother. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. My mother had just admitted that the real problem wasn't my mental health. It was my inconvenient questions about missing money. Mom, what if I told you I could prove that $400,000 was stolen from grandmother's account? I'd say that proves you need help distinguishing between reality and the conspiracy theories your grief is creating. And what if I told you I could prove that Dr. Cross isn't licensed to practice psychiatry anywhere in the United States? My mother's coffee cup clinked against its saucer as her hand trembled slightly. I'd say you're spiraling deeper into paranoid thinking, and this conversation proves you need immediate intervention. Immediate intervention meaning what? Meaning we file the conservatorship petition tomorrow morning. There it was, the threat delivered with the casual precision of someone who'd already made the decision and was simply informing me of the consequences of my defiance. Even though you know Dr. Cross's evaluation is fraudulent, I know that Dr. Cross is a mental health professional who's concerned about your well-being. If you continue to reject help, we'll have to take steps to ensure you don't harm yourself or dissipate your inheritance through poor judgment. Dissipate my inheritance how? By pursuing expensive legal challenges based on delusional beliefs about financial impropriety. The circular logic was breathtaking. My parents had stolen money from my grandmother, hired a fake psychiatrist to declare me incompetent, and were now arguing that any attempt to expose their crimes proved I was mentally ill. Mom, I said quietly, do you understand what you're telling me? I'm telling you that we love you and we're not going to let you destroy your life chasing fantasies. You're telling me that if I continue to ask questions about missing money, you'll have me declared mentally incompetent by a fake doctor so you can control my inheritance. I'm telling you that if you continue to demonstrate poor judgment and paranoid thinking, we'll take whatever legal steps are necessary to protect you from yourself. I looked at my mother across the small cafe table,
This woman who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and celebrated every achievement of my life. She was speaking in the calm, reasonable tone she'd always used when explaining why her rules were for my own good. But the rules had changed. Now my own good required surrendering my autonomy and my inheritance to people who'd already proven they were willing to steal from elderly relatives. What if I agreed to the evaluation? What if I submitted to Dr. Cross's assessment willingly? Then we could resolve this situation quickly and quietly, without involving the courts unnecessarily. And if his evaluation found that I was mentally competent? My mother hesitated just long enough to reveal that this wasn't a possibility she'd seriously consider. Then we'd accept his professional judgment, of course, but you don't think that's likely. I think you're exhibiting clear signs of psychological distress that any qualified professional would recognize, such as asking questions about financial irregularity, such as developing elaborate conspiracy theories about people who love you. I realized that no amount of evidence would convince my mother to abandon her course of action. She'd committed so deeply to the narrative of my mental instability that backing down would require acknowledging her own criminal behavior. It was easier to destroy my credibility than to admit what she'd done. I need to think about all this, I said, standing up from the table. Of course you do, but Chloe, don't take too long. Dr. Cross is concerned that delayed intervention could make your condition worse. My condition? Your grief-induced paranoia. The longer it goes untreated, the more entrenched it becomes. I hugged my mother goodbye, feeling the voice recorder in my purse like evidence of a crime I'd just witnessed. As I walked back to my car, I realized that the woman who'd raised me was gone, replaced by someone willing to sacrifice my sanity to protect her secret. But I also realized something else. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had proof, not just of my parents' intentions, but of their methods and their motives. My mother had confessed to everything while believing she was convincing me to surrender. Marcus was waiting when I got home, his laptop open on our kitchen table and papers spread around him like battle plans. He looked up when I entered, his expression anxious. How did it go? I pulled out the voice recorder and set it on the table between us. She told me everything. Marcus stared at the voice recorder for several heartbeats before reaching for it with trembling fingers. His face had gone pale, and I could see the muscle in his jaw working as he processed what I'd just told him. She actually admitted they're planning to file for conservatorship. She admitted everything. The fake evaluation, the plan to control my inheritance. Even that other families have used Dr. Cross for similar situations. I sank into the chair across from him, suddenly exhausted. Marcus, my mother just threatened to have me declared incompetent tomorrow morning if I don't submit to fraudulent psychiatric assessment. He plugged the recorder into his laptop with hands that weren't quite steady. We need to listen to this immediately and get copies to our lawyer and Rodriguez. As my mother's voice filled our kitchen through the laptop speakers, I watched Marcus's expression shift from shock to fury to something colder and more dangerous. When we reached the part where my mother described Cross as someone who helps families resolve complex psychological and financial issues, Marcus paused the recording. She's describing a criminal enterprise, he said quietly. Your mother just confessed to conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and potentially dozens of other felonies. But she thinks she's protecting the family. Chloe, she's protecting herself. $400,000 isn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. That's systematic theft that required planning and coordination. Marcus resumed the recording, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. When my mother's voice delivered the final threat about filing for conservatorship, Marcus stopped the playback and leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain that had started pattering against our windows. We have enough evidence to destroy them, he said finally, but we need to move fast. If they file that petition tomorrow morning, even with fraudulent documentation, it could trigger an emergency hearing that restricts your rights before we can challenge it. What do we do? Marcus was already reaching for his phone. We go on offense. Tonight. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and frantic preparation. Marcus contacted Dr. Rodriguez, who agreed to meet us at the hospital to review the recording and prepare expert testimony. I called Robert Morrison, who listened to selected portions of the audio through Marcus's speakerphone and immediately began drafting emergency motions to block any conservatorship filing. "Patterson," Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "this recording contains evidence of multiple felonies. I'm obligated to report this to law enforcement, but I want your permission before I involve the police." The idea of my parents being arrested felt surreal, like something that happened to other families in newspaper stories, but the alternative was allowing them to destroy my life to cover up their crimes. "Do it," I said. "Report everything. I'll contact Detective Sarah Kim with the Financial Crimes Unit. She specializes in elder abuse cases and won't be sympathetic to people who steal from vulnerable elderly relatives." After Morrison hung up, Marcus and I sat in our kitchen surrounded by legal documents and audio equipment, trying to process the magnitude of what we'd set in motion. In the span of 6 hours, we'd gone from victims of an elaborate fraud to prosecutors in a criminal case that could send my parents to prison. "Are you okay with this?" Marcus asked gently. "Once we involve law enforcement, there's no going back." I thought about my grandmother, alone in her final months while her own children systematically stole from her accounts. I thought about the fake psychiatrist my parents had hired to destroy my credibility. I thought about the casual way my mother had threatened my freedom while sipping coffee and eating pastries. "They made their choice," I said. "Now I'm making mine." Dr. Rodriguez met us at Oregon Medical Center at 8 o'clock that evening, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled from the emergency nature of our meeting. She listened to the entire recording without interruption, making notes on a legal pad, and occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. "This is worse than we thought," she said when the playback ended. "Your mother isn't just describing fraud, she's describing a systematic abuse of psychiatric authority for financial gain. If Dr. Cross has done this with other families, we're looking at a pattern of criminal behavior that spans years. Can you help us prove that his evaluation methodology is fraudulent?" "I can do better than that. I can prove that no legitimate psychiatric evaluation could possibly reach the conclusions he's claiming." Elena pulled out her tablet and began typing rapidly. "I'm going to document every aspect of proper psychological assessment that he failed to perform. The absence of standardized testing, the lack of medical history review, the impossibility of diagnosing complex psychological conditions during a dinner conversation. It's all going into a comprehensive report that will demolish his credibility." Marcus leaned forward. "How quickly can you have that ready?" "I'll work on it tonight. If your parents file their petition in the morning, I want our response ready for immediate filing." "Elena," I said, "I need you to understand what you're risking by helping. If this goes to court, you'll be testifying against people with significant financial resources and legal connections." She looked at me with the fierce expression I'd seen her use when advocating for vulnerable patients. "Chloe, I didn't spend 15 years building my career to watch criminals destroy innocent people with fake psychiatric evaluations. If they want to challenge my testimony, they're welcome to try." We left the hospital with Elena's promise to have her expert report ready by morning, and a renewed sense that we might actually have a chance to stop my parents before they could file their fraudulent petition. But as we drove through Portland's empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. "Marcus, what if they don't wait until tomorrow morning? What if they've already filed the paperwork?" Morrison checked the court records before we left his office. "Nothing's been filed yet, but what if they file tonight? Emergency petitions can be processed after hours if there's a claim of immediate danger." Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "You think they might argue that you're an immediate threat to yourself or others? My mother said delayed intervention could make my condition worse. If Dr. Cross is willing to fabricate a psychiatric evaluation, he might be willing to claim I'm actively dangerous." We drove the rest of the way home in worried silence, both of us understanding that our carefully planned counterattack could be undermined if my parents moved faster than we'd anticipated. Emergency psychiatric holds could be obtained with minimal evidence if the right keywords were used, and someone with Dr. Cross's apparent experience in manipulating the system would know exactly what phrases would trigger immediate intervention. Our apartment felt like a war room when we returned, with legal documents spread across every surface, and Marcus's laptop displaying Elena's preliminary notes. I was reviewing Morrison's draft motions when my phone rang, the caller ID showing my sister Natalie's number. "Don't answer it," Marcus said immediately. "Why not?" "Because they're either calling to threaten you with immediate filing, or to create evidence that you're unreasonable and difficult to deal with. Either way, talking to them right now only helps their case." The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. This time, it was my brother Tyler. When I didn't answer that call either, a text message appeared from my mother. "Chloe, we need to talk immediately. There have been developments that require urgent family discussion. Please call as soon as you receive this." Marcus read the message over my shoulder. Developments. Maybe they found out about our meeting with Morrison, or Elena, or both. Or maybe they're preparing to claim that your failure to respond to family outreach proves you're having a psychological crisis. The phone rang again, this time showing my father's number. When I didn't answer, another text appeared. "Chloe, your mother is very concerned about your behavior today. Dr. Cross has recommended immediate evaluation based on your conversation this afternoon. Please contact us so we can arrange appropriate care." I stared at the message, my blood running cold. "They're setting up the emergency filing. They're going to claim I'm in immediate psychological crisis and need involuntary commitment." Marcus was already dialing Morrison's number. The lawyer answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "Robert, they're escalating. We just received text suggesting they're preparing to file for emergency psychiatric intervention." "I've been expecting that," Morrison replied grimly. "I'm at my office preparing counter filings. If they try to obtain an emergency order, we'll be ready to challenge it immediately." "How quickly can they get an emergency hold?" "If Dr. Cross claims that Chloe is an immediate danger to herself or others, a judge can issue a temporary order within hours. The standard is supposed to be high, but weekend emergency judges often err on the side of caution." "It's Thursday night," I said. "Friday morning emergency filing could result in a weekend hold that doesn't get reviewed until Monday. That gives them 3 days to solidify their position." Marcus and I exchanged looks of growing alarm. 3 days in involuntary psychiatric hold would be devastating to my credibility, even if the orders were eventually overturned. The mere existence of such records could be used to support future competency challenges. "What can we do to prevent that?" "I'm filing a preemptive motion for protective order, arguing that any psychiatric evaluation must be conducted by court-appointed neutral professionals, rather than private practitioners hired by interested parties. Elena's expert testimony will support the argument that Dr. Cross's methodology is fundamentally flawed. Will that be enough?" "It should be, if we can get it in front of a judge before they file their emergency petition." After Morrison hung up, Marcus and I spent the next several hours preparing for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. We organized our evidence, made copies of all crucial documents, and established contingency plans for different scenarios. If my parents succeeded in obtaining an emergency psychiatric hold, Marcus would immediately file for habeas corpus review while Elena and Morrison challenged the underlying evaluation. But as dawn approached and my phone remained silent, I began to hope that perhaps we'd overestimated the threat. Maybe my parents were waiting for normal business hours to file their petition. Maybe they were having second thoughts about the wisdom of escalating to involuntary commitment. I was wrong. At exactly 6:30 Friday morning, my doorbell rang with the insistent rhythm of someone who wasn't going away. Marcus looked through the peephole and turned back to me with a grim expression. 2 police officers and a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase. My hands started shaking. "They got the emergency order. Let me handle this," Marcus said, straightening his shoulders. "Remember, you have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to demand review by independent medical professional." He opened the door to reveal 2 uniformed Portland police officers flanked by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Vance, a court-appointed mental health evaluator. She was holding a clipboard thick with official-looking documents. "Patterson," she said in the professionally compassionate tone of someone who'd delivered bad news many times before, "I have a court order for emergency psychological evaluation, based on credible reports that you pose an immediate danger to yourself or others." "Based on reports from whom?" Marcus asked, Dr. Vincent Cross submitted documentation indicating that Ms. Patterson has exhibited paranoid behavior, made threats against family members, and demonstrated inability to care for herself safely. Dr. Cross isn't licensed to practice in Oregon, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. The court has reviewed his credentials and found them sufficient for the purposes of emergency intervention, Dr. Vance replied. Ms. Patterson, I need you to come with us for evaluation at Cedar Hills Mental Health Facility. I refuse, I said. I demand the right to independent evaluation by board-certified psychiatrists of my choosing. You can request that during the formal review process, but the emergency order requires immediate compliance. She gestured to the police officers. I'd prefer this to be voluntary, but the court order authorizes involuntary transport if necessary. Marcus stepped forward. I'm Dr. Marcus Hartwell, a licensed psychiatrist and Ms. Patterson's husband. I can attest that she shows no signs of immediate psychological danger. Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but the court has determined that family members may not be objective in these situations. The evaluation must be conducted by neutral professionals. Neutral professionals who weren't hired by the people seeking to control her inheritance. Dr. Vance's expression tightened slightly. Hartwell, if you interfere with the execution of this court order, you'll be subject to arrest for obstruction. I realized that we'd lost this round before it started. My parents had successfully obtained an emergency order based on Cross's fraudulent evaluation, and no amount of protest would prevent them from forcing me into involuntary commitment. The only option was to comply and fight the order through legal channels. Give me 5 minutes to get dressed and gather some personal items, I said. Of course, Officer Martinez will accompany you to ensure your safety. The female police officer followed me to our bedroom, where I quickly changed into jeans and a sweater while trying to process the surreal reality of being arrested for the crime of asking questions about my inheritance. As I packed a small bag with toiletries and medications, I could hear Marcus in the living room, presumably calling Morrison and Elena to mobilize our legal response. When I emerged from the bedroom, Marcus was waiting with a folder of documents and a fierce expression. I've contacted our lawyer and Dr. Rodriguez. They're filing for immediate review, but it might take several hours to get in front of a judge. Several hours felt like several lifetimes when facing involuntary psychiatric commitment, but I nodded and kissed him goodbye, tasting salt that might have been from my tears or his. Remember, he whispered against my ear, don't say anything that can be twisted against you. Ask for a second opinion on everything. And Chloe, this isn't permanent. We're going to get you out of there. The ride to Cedar Hills Mental Health Facility passed in a blur of Portland morning traffic and radio chatter from the police cruiser. Dr. Vance sat beside me in the back seat, making notes on her clipboard and occasionally asking questions I answered with polite variations of, I'd prefer to discuss that with my attorney present. Cedar Hills was a converted hospital building in southeast Portland, surrounded by high fences and security cameras that made it look more like a prison than a treatment center. As we pulled through the main gate, I understood that my parents had successfully removed me from normal society and placed me in an environment where my credibility would be automatically suspect, and my freedom completely dependent on the opinions of strangers. The intake process was designed to be as dehumanizing as possible. I was required to surrender all personal belongings, submit to a physical search, and answer a lengthy questionnaire about my mental health history while being observed by staff members who made notes about my affect and cooperation level. Every response was recorded and analyzed for signs of psychological disturbance. Ms. Patterson, said the intake coordinator, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes and premature gray hair, I need to explain the process you'll be going through. You're here on a 72-hour emergency hold, which means we have 3 days to evaluate your mental state and determine whether extended treatment is necessary. I want to speak with an attorney. You'll have that opportunity during regular business hours. For now, we need to focus on ensuring your immediate safety and well-being. I also want a second psychiatric opinion from a doctor not connected to this facility or the people who had me committed. That's certainly your right, and we'll discuss those options with you tomorrow. Tomorrow. Everything was always tomorrow when you were involuntarily committed, as if your freedom and autonomy could wait for the convenience of institutional schedule. I was assigned to a shared room with a woman named Janet, who spent most of her time staring at soap operas on the mounted television and occasionally muttering comments about the characters' relationship. She seemed harmless enough, but the constant background noise of her commentary made it impossible to think clearly about my legal situation. The first psychiatrist I met was Dr. James Chen, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who seemed genuinely interested in understanding why I'd been brought to the facility. Unlike Dr. Cross, he asked detailed questions about my background, my work, my marriage, and my recent stressors. Ms. Patterson, the referral documentation suggests you've been experiencing paranoid thoughts about family members stealing money from your grandmother's estate.
Can you tell me about that? I chose my words carefully, understanding that anything I said could be used to justify extended commitment. I've been trying to understand some financial discrepancies in my grandmother's medical expenses. The amounts seemed higher than expected for someone with comprehensive insurance coverage. And what conclusions have you drawn from these discrepancies? I haven't drawn any conclusions. I've simply been asking questions and trying to gather more information. Dr. Chen made notes on his tablet. The documentation also suggests you've been resistant to psychiatric evaluation and hostile toward family members who expressed concern about your well-being. I've been resistant to evaluation by unlicensed individuals, and I've been concerned about family members who seem more interested in controlling my inheritance than my well-being. That's an interesting distinction. Can you elaborate on the difference between licensed and unlicensed evaluators? For the first time since entering the facility, I felt a spark of hope. Dr. Chen seemed genuinely interested in the details of what had happened, rather than simply confirming a predetermined diagnosis. Cross, who recommended my commitment, isn't licensed to practice psychiatry in Oregon or any other state. His evaluation consisted of observing me during a family dinner and asking leading questions designed to support conclusions he'd apparently already reached. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. You've verified that Dr. Cross isn't licensed? My husband is a psychiatrist at Oregon Medical Center. He checked multiple databases and confirmed that no one named Vincent Cross holds active psychiatric licenses anywhere in the United States. That's a serious allegation. Do you have documentation of this research? My husband does. He's been working with other licensed psychiatrists to document the fraudulent nature of Dr. Cross's evaluation. Chen was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what I'd told him. If I was telling the truth about Dr. Cross's credentials, then my commitment was based on fraudulent documentation, which would be grounds for immediate release and possible criminal charges against everyone involved. Ms. Patterson, I'm going to need to verify some of the information you've provided. That may take some time. How much time? Possibly several days, depending on how quickly I can reach the appropriate licensing boards and verify credentials. Several days in involuntary commitment while Dr. Chen conducted research that Marcus had already completed. Felt like cruel and unusual punishment, but I understood that institutional bureaucracy moved at its own pace, regardless of the human cost. Dr. Chen, my husband and our attorney have already compiled extensive documentation about Dr. Cross's fraudulent credentials. If you contacted them, they could provide you with everything you need to verify my claims immediately. I appreciate that suggestion, but I need to conduct independent verification through official channel. However, I will note in your file that you've provided specific, verifiable claims about the credentials of the referring physician. It wasn't the immediate release I'd hoped for, but it was progress. Chen seemed like someone who would actually investigate the truth rather than simply rubber-stamping Dr. Cross's recommendation. The rest of my first day at Cedar Hills passed slowly, filled with group therapy sessions where I listened to other patients discuss their genuine mental health struggles while trying not to reveal information that could be used against me. During lunch, I met Rebecca, a woman in her 30s who'd been committed by her abusive husband using similar tactics to what my parents had employed. The key is to stay calm and reasonable, she whispered during our brief conversation in the day room. Don't give them any ammunition by getting angry or emotional. Document everything you can remember, and keep asking for second opinions. How long have you been here? 3 weeks. My husband claimed I was having a psychotic break because I tried to leave him and take our children. He found a psychiatrist willing to say I was delusional and dangerous. But that's not true, is it? Of course it's not true, but proving that takes time. And in the meantime, he has custody of our kids and control of our finance. Rebecca's story was a chilling preview of what my life could become if my parents succeeded in their plan. She was clearly sane, clearly a victim of abuse rather than someone suffering from mental illness, but the institutional machinery ground forward regardless of truth or justice. That evening, as I lay in my narrow bed listening to Janet's commentary on late-night television, I tried to focus on the positive developments of the day. Dr. Chin seemed willing to investigate my claims about Dr. Cross's fraudulent credentials. Marcus and our legal team were presumably working around the clock to secure my release. Elena Rodriguez was preparing expert testimony that would demolish any attempt to use psychiatric evaluation as a weapon against me. But I also understood that I was fighting more than just my parents' greed and Dr. Cross's fraudulent evaluation. I was fighting an entire system that automatically assumed mental health facilities were populated with people who belonged there, that automatically trusted psychiatrists over patients, and that automatically treated involuntary commitment as evidence of legitimate mental illness. The next morning brought a visit from Marcus, who looked like he hadn't slept since I'd been taken away. We met in a small conference room under the watchful eye of a staff member who recorded our conversation for my treatment file. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I'm fine. More importantly, how are you holding up?" Morrison filed for immediate habeas corpus review, and Elena submitted her expert report documenting the fraudulent nature of Cross's evaluation. "We should have a hearing sometime today. What about Detective Kim? Has she opened an investigation into the financial crimes?" Marcus glanced at the staff member who was monitoring our conversation. "There have been developments in that area that we'll discuss when you're released." I understood that he couldn't reveal details about the criminal investigation while we were being recorded, but his carefully neutral expression suggested that the news was positive. "Marcus, I need you to know that Dr. Chen seems willing to investigate the truth about Dr. Cross's credentials. If you can get him documentation of your research, it might expedite my release through medical channels even if the legal challenges take longer. I'll contact him this afternoon. And Marcus, I need you to know that no matter what happens, I don't regret fighting back. Even if it means spending time in here, even if it means destroying my relationship with my family permanently. They made their choice, and I'm making mine." Marcus reached across the table and took my hand, ignoring the staff member's disapproving look. "You're the bravest person I know, and you're not fighting this alone." After Marcus left, I spent the rest of the morning in group therapy sessions and individual meetings with various staff members who assessed my progress and insight into my supposed mental health issue. I answered their questions carefully, acknowledging stress about family conflict while maintaining that my concerns about financial irregularities were based on legitimate evidence, rather than paranoid delusions. It was during lunch that everything changed. Chen appeared in the day room with a tablet in his hand and an expression I couldn't quite read. He gestured for me to join him in a private conference room, where he sat across from me with the deliberate movements of someone delivering important news. "Patterson, I've completed my verification of Dr. Vincent Cross's credentials, and there is no licensed psychiatrist named Vincent Cross anywhere in the United States. There never has been." Relief flooded through me so suddenly I felt lightheaded. "So you're releasing me?" "I'm releasing you immediately. More than that, I'm filing a formal complaint with law enforcement about the fraudulent documentation used to justify your commitment." "Dr. Chen, I can't thank you enough." "Don't thank me yet. Ms. Patterson, what happened to you represents a serious breach of professional ethics and legal standards. I've been practicing psychiatry for 15 years, and I've never seen such a blatant abuse of emergency commitment procedures. What happens now? Now you go home." But I suspect this is far from over.
People who are willing to manufacture psychiatric evaluations for financial gain rarely stop at one crime. As I walked out of Cedar Hill's mental health facility, less than 24 hours after being involuntarily committed, I felt like I was emerging from a nightmare into harsh daylight. Marcus was waiting in the parking lot, along with Robert Morrison and Detective Sarah Kim, a stern-looking woman in her 40s, who introduced herself as the lead investigator on my case. Patterson Detective Kim said, "We need to discuss the evidence you've gathered about financial crimes committed against your grandmother. Based on your recordings and Dr. Rodriguez's expert testimony, we have enough to proceed with criminal charges against multiple individuals." Criminal charges? Elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and now false imprisonment through fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Your parents and Dr. Cross are looking at serious prison time. I stared at Detective Kim, struggling to process that my parents might actually face criminal consequences for their actions. For so long they'd seemed untouchable, protected by their wealth and social connections, and the assumption that family disputes were private matters. What happens next? Marcus said, putting his arm around my shoulders. We make sure they never hurt anyone else the way they tried to hurt you. As we drove away from Cedar Hills, I realized that the nightmare was ending, but the real work was just beginning. My parents had declared war on my sanity and my freedom, but they'd underestimated my husband's expertise and my own determination to fight back. They were about to learn what happened when you tried to destroy someone who refused to be destroyed. The afternoon sunlight felt like freedom as we sat in Detective Kim's office at the Portland Police Bureau downtown, surrounded by file folders and evidence bags that represented months of investigation into my family's crime. Sarah Kim was methodical in her approach, spreading documents across her desk like a prosecutor preparing for trial. "Ms. Patterson, what I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to process," she began, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd delivered devastating news many times before. "Our financial crimes unit has been investigating Dr. Vincent Cross for the past 18 months as part of a broader investigation into fraudulent psychiatric evaluations." 18 months? Marcus leaned forward. "You've known about him for over a year. We've been building a case against a network of individuals who specialize in manufacturing psychiatric evaluations for families involved in inheritance disputes. Dr. Cross is one of several fake professionals who've been operating in Oregon, Washington, and California." Detective Kim opened the first folder, revealing photographs of at least a dozen different people, all labeled with case numbers and dates. "Cross has been involved in 43 documented cases of fraudulent psychiatric evaluation over the past 5 years. Your case gave us the breakthrough we needed to connect him directly to the financial crimes being committed by his clients." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Dr. Cross hadn't just targeted my family. He'd been systematically helping criminals steal from elderly relatives and vulnerable adults across the Pacific Northwest. My parents had hired him as part of an established criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. How many people has he helped steal from? Conservatively, we estimate that Cross and his network have facilitated the theft of over $12 million from vulnerable individuals. The youngest victim was 19. A college student whose parents wanted control of her trust fund. The oldest was 87, a man whose children had him declared incompetent to prevent him from donating his fortune to charity. I stared at the photographs, each one representing someone whose life had been destroyed by the same tactics my parents had used against me. Are any of these people still under conservatorship? 14 of them are still legally controlled by family members who used Cross's evaluations to justify ongoing financial management. We're working to reverse those orders, but it's a slow process. Detective Kim opened another folder, this one containing financial records and bank statements. Your parents' case is actually one of the less sophisticated schemes we've encountered. Most of Cross's clients are careful to steal smaller amounts over longer periods to avoid detection. Your parents got greedy. $400,000 is greedy. $400,000 in 6 months while leaving obvious documentation trails is extremely greedy. Most of Cross's clients take $5,000 or $10,000 at a time over several years. Your parents cleaned out your grandmother's accounts so quickly that they created a paper trail a first-year accounting student could follow. Marcus examined the bank statements, Why did they think they could get away with it? Because they thought they could control the narrative. If they succeeded in having Chloe declared incompetent, her questions about the missing money would be dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. They could claim she was having delusions about financial impropriety while they quietly moved the stolen funds into accounts she'd never be able to access. But they didn't count on Marcus being a real psychiatrist who could expose Cross's fraud. That's what broke the case open. Dr. Hartwell's expertise allowed us to build an airtight case against Cross's methods, and your recordings provided evidence of the broader conspiracy. Detective Kim smiled grimly. Your parents essentially confessed to multiple felonies while believing they were convincing you to surrender. The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't involved the systematic destruction of vulnerable people's lives. My parents had been so confident in their ability to manipulate the situation that they'd provided law enforcement with a complete roadmap of their criminal activity. What charges are they facing? Detective Kim consulted a legal document. Richard and Diane Patterson are being charged with elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, theft in the first degree, and accessory to false imprisonment. If convicted on all counts, they're looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. 20 years, the number hung in the air like a death sentence. Despite everything they'd done, despite their willingness to destroy my life to cover their crimes, the thought of my parents spending decades in prison felt surreal. What about Dr. Cross? Vincent Cross, whose real name is Vincent Rossini, is facing charges in multiple jurisdictions. In Oregon alone, he's looking at 47 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and impersonating a medical professional. The federal charges for operating a criminal enterprise across state lines could add another 20 years. Detective Kim opened a third folder revealing surveillance photographs of a man I recognized as Dr. Cross entering various buildings with different people. Cross has been using multiple identities and fake credentials for years. He's not just a fake psychiatrist, he's a professional criminal who specializes in exploiting family disputes for financial gain. How did he learn enough about psychiatry to fool people? He's actually quite intelligent. Cross has a master's degree in psychology from a legitimate university, but he never completed his doctoral studies or obtained clinical licensure. He knows enough about psychological terminology to sound credible to people who don't work in the field. Marcus shook his head, but any real psychiatrist would have spotted the fraud immediately. That's why he avoided working with families that included mental health professionals. Your case was unusual because he apparently didn't know about Hartwell's background until after he'd already committed to the evaluation. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with devastating clarity. My parents had hired Cross believing they were dealing with a sophisticated professional who could provide them with undetectable psychiatric cover for their theft. Instead, they'd hired a criminal whose methods were so sloppy that they'd led law enforcement directly to evidence of their broader conspiracy. Detective Kim, what happens to the other victim? We're working to notify everyone we can identify and help them reverse the conservatorships that were obtained through fraudulent evaluations. In many cases, the stolen money has already been spent, so financial recovery will be difficult, but at least we can restore their legal autonomy. The scope of the tragedy was overwhelming. Dozens of families had been torn apart by greed and manipulation, with vulnerable individuals losing not just their money but their fundamental right to make decisions about their own lives. My parents were part of a criminal network that had systematically destroyed people's freedom and dignity for profit. What about the lawyers and judges who approved these fraudulent conservatorships? That's a more complex issue. Most of the legal professionals involved appear to have been legitimately deceived by Cross's fake credentials. However, we're investigating several attorneys who may have known about the fraud and participated anyway. Detective Kim closed the folders and leaned back in her chair. Patterson, I need you to understand that your willingness to fight back probably saved dozens of other people from becoming victims. If you'd submitted to Cross's evaluation, if you'd allowed your parents to control your inheritance, this criminal enterprise would have continued operating indefinitely. The weight of that responsibility felt both humbling and terrifying. By refusing to be silenced, by insisting on exposing the truth, I'd accidentally become the key to dismantling a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for years. When do the arrests happen? We're executing warrants tomorrow morning. Your parents will be taken into custody at their home, and Cross will be arrested simultaneously in California where he's currently working on another case, tomorrow morning. In less than 24 hours my parents would be in jail, their carefully constructed lives destroyed by the same greed that had driven them to steal from my grandmother. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but instead I felt a profound sadness for the people they'd chosen to become. Will I need to testify? Eventually, yes, but we have enough evidence to proceed with initial charges based on your recordings and Dr. Rodriguez's expert testimony. The actual trial preparation will take months. Marcus reached for my hand. Are you ready for this? I thought about my grandmother, alone in her final months while her children systematically looted her accounts. I thought about Rebecca, still trapped in the mental health facility because her abusive husband had found his own version of Dr. Cross. I thought about the photographs of other victims, each one representing someone whose life had been destroyed by the same criminal enterprise that had targeted me. I'm ready. We left Detective Kim's office as the sun was setting over Portland, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the bruises I'd seen on abuse victims in the emergency room. The city looked different from this new vantage point, as if learning about the criminal conspiracy had revealed hidden layers of vulnerability and predation that existed beneath the surface of normal life. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Do you think I'm making the right choice, destroying my family to expose their crimes? Marcus stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious. Chloe, they destroyed themselves when they decided to steal from your grandmother and hire a fake psychiatrist to silence you. You're not destroying your family, you're refusing to be destroyed by them, but they're still my parents. 20 years in prison is a death sentence for people their age. And how many years would you have lost if they'd succeeded? How many other people would have been victimized while you sat silently in a conservatorship you couldn't challenge? The truth of his words was undeniable, but it didn't make the emotional weight any easier to bear. I was about to send my parents to prison, and regardless of how justified that action might be, it would fundamentally change who I was as a person. I keep thinking about when I was 8 years old and had pneumonia, I said. My mother stayed by my bedside for 3 days, barely sleeping, making sure I had everything I needed. She was genuinely caring and protective. I can't reconcile that person with someone who would hire a fake psychiatrist to have me declared insane. People change, Chloe, or maybe the person you remember was always capable of what she did, but you never saw that side of her because you weren't a threat to her interest. That's a terrifying thought. It is, but it's also liberating. You don't have to carry guilt for other people's choices, even if those people are your parents. We drove home through Portland's evening traffic, past the familiar landmarks of the life we'd built together. Our apartment building, the coffee shop where we'd had our first date, the bookstore where Marcus had proposed to me on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, because he couldn't wait for a more romantic moment. Everything looked the same, but I felt fundamentally different, as if the past week had aged me in ways that couldn't be measured in days or months. Our apartment felt like a sanctuary after the institutional sterility of Cedar Hills and the cold efficiency of the police station. Marcus immediately began preparing dinner while I sat on our couch, trying to process everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. Marcus, what if this ruins your career? What do you mean? You're married to someone whose family is about to be prosecuted for major financial crimes. What if that affects your reputation at the hospital? Marcus paused in his chopping of vegetables. Chloe, you're a victim of crimes, not a perpetrator. If anyone at the hospital has a problem with that, they're not people whose opinions matter. But what if patients' families research your background and find out about the scandal? Then they'll find out that I married a woman who was brave enough to expose criminal activity even when it meant destroying her relationship with her family. I can't think of anything that would make me proud. The simple certainty in his voice broke something loose in my chest that I'd been holding tight since this nightmare began. For the first time in a week, I cried, not from fear or anger, but from relief that I wasn't facing this alone. Marcus held me while I sobbed, his hands stroking my hair, and his voice murmuring reassurances that we would get through this together. When the tears finally subsided, I felt emptied out but also somehow cleaner, as if I'd been carrying toxic emotions that needed to be released. There's something else I need to tell you, Marcus said gently. Elena Rodriguez asked me to give you a message. What message? She said that what you did took extraordinary courage, and she wanted you to know that the psychiatric community is going to make sure nothing like this happens to anyone else. What does that mean? It means Elena is working with the state medical board to implement new safeguards for emergency psychiatric evaluations. Your case is going to change how the system works. The idea that my traumatic experience might prevent similar tragedies from happening to other people felt like finding meaning in chaos. If my willingness to fight back resulted in systemic changes that protected vulnerable individuals from fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, then perhaps the cost had been worth paying. Marcus, I need to ask you one more thing. Anything. After this is over, after the trials and the media attention, and all the legal proceedings, do you think we can have a normal life together? Marcus smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him in days. Chloe, I think we can have whatever kind of life we choose to build, and I think it's going to be extraordinary. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since this ordeal began, secure in the knowledge that my parents couldn't hurt me anymore, and that justice was finally moving forward. I dreamed of my grandmother, not as the frail woman she'd been in her final months, but as the fierce protector who'd built safeguards into her will to prevent exactly what my parents had attempted. In the dream, she was sitting in her garden, surrounded by the roses she'd tended for decades. She looked up when I approached, her eyes bright with the intelligence that had never dimmed, despite her advancing age. I knew you'd fight back, she said simply. I knew you wouldn't let them win. I'm sorry I couldn't save you from what they did. Sweetheart, you did save me. You made sure they couldn't do it to anyone else. I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing, the caller ID showing Detective Kim's number. For a moment, I was disoriented, caught between the peaceful certainty of my dream and the harsh reality of criminal prosecutions and family destruction. Ms. Patterson, I wanted to let you know that the arrests went smoothly this morning. Your parents are in custody, and Vincent Cross was arrested in Los Angeles. All three are being held without bail pending arraignment. How did they react? Your parents seemed genuinely shocked that we'd been investigating them. I think they believed their own narrative about protecting you from your psychological problems. And Cross tried to run. He had fake identity documents and a substantial amount of cash in his hotel room. This wasn't his first attempt to evade law enforcement. I thanked Detective Kim and hung up, then sat in our kitchen drinking coffee and trying to absorb the reality that my parents were in jail. 24 hours ago, they'd been free to continue their lives, confident that they'd successfully neutralized the threat I posed to their crimes. Now they were facing the destruction of everything they'd built, all because they'd underestimated their daughter's determination to fight back. Marcus emerged from the shower, already dressed for work. How are you feeling? Like I'm living in someone else's life. Yesterday my parents were respected members of Portland society. Today they're in jail awaiting trial for elder abuse and fraud. Do you regret fighting back? I considered the question while watching Marcus prepare his breakfast with the same methodical care he brought to everything in his life. 6 months ago, my biggest worry had been whether to take the evening shift rotation at the hospital. Now I was a key witness in a criminal conspiracy that had victimized dozens of families across multiple states. No, I said finally, I don't regret it, but I do feel like I'm mourning the parents I thought I had. That's natural. Grief is the appropriate response when you discover that people you loved were different from who you believed them to be. Marcus, what if I'm wrong about this? What if there's some explanation that makes sense of everything they did? Marcus sat across from me at our kitchen table, his expression gentle but serious. Chloe, your parents hired a fake psychiatrist to have you declared mentally incompetent so they could steal your inheritance.
There's no explanation that makes that acceptable. But what if they genuinely believed I was having psychological problems? Then they would have arranged for evaluation by licensed professionals using proper procedures. They would have involved you in the process rather than ambushing you with fraudulent documentation. They would have sought treatment for your supposed problems rather than seeking control over your money. The logic was irrefutable, but emotion rarely followed logical pathways. Despite everything my parents had done, despite the evidence of their crimes and the testimony of their victims, part of me still wanted to believe that they'd been motivated by love rather than greed. I think I need to see them, I said. Marcus's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. See them, in jail. I need to look them in the eye and ask them why they did this. Chloe, I don't think that's a good idea. Anything you say to them could be used in their defense, and anything they say to you could be used to manipulate your emotions. I know, but I need to understand how they justified this to themselves. I need to know if there's any part of the people who raised me left inside the criminals they became. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his concerns about my emotional well-being against his respect for my autonomy. If you're determined to do this, I want to come with you. They probably won't let you into the meeting. Then I'll wait in the lobby, but I'm not letting you face this alone. We spent the morning making arrangements for a jail visit, a process that involved background checks and scheduling through the corrections system. By afternoon, I was sitting in the visitation room at Multnomah County Jail, waiting for my parents to be brought in. The room was designed to be as depressing as possible, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick and plastic chairs that had been bolted to the floor. A thick plexiglass barrier separated visitors from inmates, with conversations conducted through telephone handsets that had been sanitized with industrial-strength disinfectant. My parents entered together, wearing orange jumpsuits that made them look smaller and older than I remember. My mother's perfectly styled hair was limp and unkempt, and my father's confident bearing had been replaced by the hunched posture of someone who'd been broken by circumstances beyond his control. They sat across from me, each of them picking up a phone handset with movements that seemed mechanical and uncertain. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Chloe, my mother said finally, her voice barely audible through the static-filled connection. I can't believe you did this to us. I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourselves. We were trying to protect you, my father said, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone who'd repeated the same justification so many times it had lost all meaning. We were trying to keep you from making mistakes that would destroy your life. By stealing $400,000 from grandmother. By preventing you from squandering your inheritance on legal fees and conspiracy theory. The circular logic was exactly what I'd expected. But hearing it spoken aloud was still jarring. My parents had so completely convinced themselves that their actions were justified, that they genuinely believed I was the one who'd committed betrayal. Mom, Dad, I need you to understand something. Dr. Cross isn't a real psychiatrist. He's a criminal who's been helping families steal from elderly relatives for years. You hired him to manufacture evidence that I was mentally incompetent, so you could control my inheritance. That's not true, my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. It is true. The police have documentation going back 5 years, showing that Cross has been involved in dozens of similar cases. You were part of a criminal conspiracy that victimized vulnerable people across multiple states. My father's face went pale. We didn't know about any other case. We thought Cross was a legitimate professional who could help resolve family disputes. How did you find him? Through our business attorney. He said Cross had helped other families navigate inheritance-related stress. Other families who needed relatives declared incompetent. Other families who were dealing with psychological issues that affected financial decision-making. The euphemisms were incredible. My parents had hired a fake psychiatrist to destroy my credibility, but they'd convinced themselves they were providing therapeutic intervention for my supposed mental health problems. Do you understand that I was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility based on fraudulent evaluation? You were provided with professional mental health assessment because you were exhibiting signs of paranoid behavior, my mother replied. I was asking questions about missing money from grandmother's medical expense. You were developing elaborate conspiracy theories about people who love you. We were speaking past each other, trapped in completely different versions of reality. My parents had constructed a narrative that painted their crimes as acts of love, and they'd become so invested in that story that they couldn't acknowledge the truth even when faced with criminal prosecution. Mom, Dad, I need you to tell me something. And I need you to be completely honest. Did you take money from grandmother's accounts that wasn't used for her medical care? They looked at each other through the plexiglass barrier, and I saw a moment of silent communication that excluded me completely. We managed your grandmother's finances responsibly during her final illness. My father said carefully, "That's not what I asked."
Some of the medical expenses were paid in advance or involved services that weren't covered by traditional insurance, my mother added. $400,000 worth of services that left no documentation trail. Complex medical situations require complex financial arrangements. My father replied. They were going to maintain their story until the end. I realized, even facing decades in prison, even confronted with overwhelming evidence of their crimes, they would continue to claim they'd been protecting me from myself. The alternative would require admitting that they'd become people capable of stealing from a dying elderly woman, and that admission would destroy their fundamental sense of who they were. I need to go, I said, standing up from the plastic chair. Chloe, please, my mother said, pressing her hand against the plexiglass barrier. We're still your family, we still love you. No, I said quietly. Family doesn't try to have each other declared insane to cover up theft. Family doesn't hire fake psychiatrists to destroy each other's credibility. You stopped being my family the moment you decided I was expendable. I hung up the phone and walked out of the visitation room, leaving my parents sitting in their orange jumpsuits, still believing they were victims of circumstances beyond their control. Marcus was waiting in the lobby and he didn't ask questions when he saw my face. He simply put his arm around my shoulders and guided me toward the exit. Understanding that some conversations were too painful to rehash immediately, as we walked out of the jail into the afternoon sunlight, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. My parents had chosen to become criminals and they'd chosen to maintain their delusions, even when faced with the consequences of their actions. I'd given them an opportunity to acknowledge the truth and seek redemption, but they'd rejected that opportunity in favor of continued self-deception. Are you okay? Marcus asked as we reached the car. I'm sad, I said, but I'm also free. For the first time in my life, I'm completely free from their manipulation and control. That's a painful kind of freedom. It is, but it's also the only kind of freedom that matters. As we drove home through Portland's afternoon traffic, I realized that I'd spent my entire life trying to be the daughter my parents wanted me to be, never understanding that their love was conditional on my compliance with their expectations. Now that I'd broken free from those expectations, I could finally discover who I was when I wasn't performing for their approval. The person I discovered was someone I actually loved, someone who fought back against injustice, who protected vulnerable people, who refused to be silenced by threats or manipulation, someone who was worthy of the love Marcus offered freely, without conditions or expectation. It had taken a criminal conspiracy and the destruction of my family to teach me that lesson, but perhaps some truths could only be learned through fire. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse hallway watching my parents' defense attorney argue with the prosecutor about plea bargain terms. The trial had been scheduled to begin that morning, but last-minute negotiations were attempting to avoid the spectacle of a public proceeding that would expose every detail of their criminal conspiracy. Marcus squeezed my hand as we waited, both of us dressed in our most professional attire for what we'd expected to be the first day of testimony. Instead, we were witnessing the final collapse of my parents' legal strategy, their attorney finally acknowledging that the evidence against them was overwhelming. Ms. Patterson, Detective Kim, approached us with a satisfied expression. I wanted to let you know that Vincent Cross accepted a plea deal this morning. 25 years in federal prison, plus restitution to all identified victims. 25 years. He cooperated fully with our investigation into the broader criminal network. His testimony has helped us identify 17 other fake professionals who were operating similar schemes across the country. The scope of the conspiracy had continued to expand throughout the investigation. What had started as my parents' attempt to steal my inheritance had revealed a nationwide network of criminals who specialized in exploiting family disputes for financial gain. Elder abuse, fraudulent psychiatric evaluations, and manufactured conservatorships had become a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had victimized hundreds of families. What about the other victims? We've helped overturn 32 fraudulent conservatorships so far, and we've recovered over $4 million in stolen assets. It's not enough to compensate for all the damage that was done, but it's a start. Robert Morrison emerged from the prosecutor's office, his expression grim but determined. Ms. Patterson, your parents are refusing to accept responsibility for their actions. They're maintaining that they were legitimate victims of Dr. Cross's deception, claiming they genuinely believed they were protecting you from psychological problems. So they're going to trial? Unless they change their minds in the next hour. Yet they're facing 15 felony counts each, and if convicted they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison. The irony was crushing. My parents had been so successful at convincing themselves that their crimes were acts of love that they'd rather face life sentences than acknowledge the truth about what they'd done. Their self-deception had become so complete that they'd rejected multiple opportunities for reduced sentences in exchange for accepting responsibility. Morrison, what are their chances if this goes to trial? With the evidence we have, zero. The recordings alone would convict them, but we also have financial documentation, expert testimony from Dr. Rodriguez, and Cross's cooperation in detailing exactly how the scheme worked. Then why are they refusing to plead? Because pleading guilty would require admitting that they stole from your grandmother and hired a fake psychiatrist to have you declared incompetent. They've convinced themselves that acknowledging those facts would be a betrayal of their own narrative. Marcus shook his head. They'd rather spend the rest of their lives in prison than admit they were wrong. It appears so. The courthouse doors opened, and my parents emerged flanked by their attorneys and court office. They looked smaller than I remembered, aged by months of incarceration and the stress of impending trial. My mother's eyes found mine across the hallway, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the woman who'd raised me, vulnerable and frightened beneath the pride that had driven her to destroy so many lives. But then her expression hardened, and she turned away without acknowledgement. Even facing life in prison, even confronted with overwhelming evidence of their crimes, my parents chose to maintain their delusions, rather than seek forgiveness from the daughter they'd tried to destroy. Ms. Patterson, the prosecutor approached our group. I need to prepare you for what's about to happen. Your parents' defense strategy is going to focus on portraying you as an unreliable witness whose mental health issues motivated false accusations against loving family members. Even though we have recordings of them confessing to the crime, they're going to argue that you manipulated those conversations to create false evidence. They're going to claim that your marriage to a psychiatrist gave you access to professional knowledge that you used to fabricate psychological symptoms. The breathtaking audacity of their defense strategy was almost admirable. My parents were going to argue that I'd orchestrated an elaborate frame-up involving law enforcement, licensed psychiatrists, and federal investigations, all to cover up my own psychological problems and justify false accusations against innocent family members. How long will the trial take? 2 weeks, possibly 3. We have over 40 witnesses to call, including victims of the broader conspiracy and expert testimony about fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. And then your parents will spend the rest of their lives in prison, and you can finally move on with your life. The trial began the following Monday with jury selection that took 3 days. My parents' attorneys challenged every potential juror who had elderly relatives or experience with mental health issues, attempting to find 12 people who might believe their narrative of victimization by a manipulative daughter and a criminal psychiatrist. The prosecutors challenged every potential juror who expressed skepticism about elder abuse, or suggested that family disputes should be resolved privately rather than through criminal prosecution. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 24 to 68, representing a cross-section of Portland society that would determine my parents' fate. Opening statements revealed the fundamental divide in how each side viewed the case. The prosecution painted my parents as sophisticated criminals who'd systematically stolen from a vulnerable elderly woman, and then hired a fake psychiatrist to silence the family member who threatened to expose their crime. The defense portrayed my parents as loving grandparents who'd been manipulated by a daughter whose psychological problems had been exacerbated by marriage to a psychiatrist who'd taught her to weaponize mental health terminology against her own family. Ladies and gentlemen, my parents' attorney addressed the jury. This case is about a family torn apart by grief and psychological manipulation. Richard and Diane Patterson are not criminals. They are heartbroken parents who tried to help their daughter through a psychological crisis, only to be falsely accused of crimes they never committed. The prosecutor's opening statement was more direct. The evidence will show that the defendants stole over $400,000 from Rose Patterson's medical accounts, then hired Vincent Cross, a known criminal to manufacture psychiatric evidence that would prevent their daughter from exposing their theft. This is not a family dispute. This is a criminal conspiracy. I testified on the second day of the trial, walking through the timeline of events from my initial questions about my grandmother's medical expenses, through the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, and my involuntary commitment. The prosecutor guided me through each piece of evidence methodically, establishing a clear narrative of criminal behavior. Ms. Patterson, when you first noticed discrepancies in your grandmother's medical expenses, what did you do? I tried to discuss them with my parents. I asked reasonable questions about the amounts and requested documentation to help me understand where the money had gone. And how did your parents respond? They became defensive and evasive. They told me I was being inappropriate, and suggested I was developing unhealthy obsessions with financial details. What happened next? They arranged for me to meet with Dr. Vincent Cross, claiming he was a psychiatrist who could help me process my grief in a healthy way. Did you consent to psychiatric evaluation? I was told we were having a family dinner, not a psychiatric evaluation. I was ambushed with an assessment I'd never agreed to participate in. The cross-examination was brutal. My parents' attorney spent 2 days trying to portray me as an unreliable narrator whose psychological problems had motivated false accusations against innocent family members. Ms. Patterson, isn't it true that you were experiencing significant stress related to your grandmother's death? I was grieving, but I wasn't psychologically impaired. Isn't it true that your husband is a psychiatrist who taught you professional terminology that you used to manipulate this situation? My husband helped me understand that Dr. Cross wasn't licensed to practice psychiatry. That's not manipulation. That's factual verification. Isn't it true that you recorded your conversation with your mother without her knowledge or consent? I recorded a conversation in which my mother threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent if I continued asking questions about missing money. Isn't it true that you've systematically destroyed your parents' reputation and freedom to avoid taking responsibility for your own psychological problems? I've exposed criminal activity that victimized my grandmother and dozens of other vulnerable people. The cross-examination continued for hours, with my parents' attorney attempting to create doubt about my credibility and motivation. But the recordings spoke for themselves, and no amount of character assassination could change the fact that my mother had confessed to hiring a fake psychiatrist to manufacture psychiatric evidence. Marcus testified on the 4th day, explaining the standards of psychiatric evaluation, and detailing exactly how Dr. Cross's methods deviated from accepted practices. His testimony was technical but devastating, methodically dismantling any suggestion that Cross had conducted legitimate psychological assessment. Dr. Hartwell, in your professional opinion, could the evaluation described by Dr. Cross result in valid psychological conclusions? Absolutely not. Proper psychological evaluation requires hours of standardized testing, review of medical history, and extensive clinical interviews. You cannot diagnose complex psychological conditions during a dinner conversation. Are you familiar with Dr. Vincent Cross's credentials? I researched his background extensively. There is no licensed psychiatrist named Vincent Cross anywhere in the United States. There never has been. In your professional opinion, what was Dr. Cross attempting to accomplish? He was manufacturing psychiatric evidence to support predetermined conclusions about Ms. Patterson's mental state. This wasn't evaluation, it was fabrication. Dr. Rodriguez testified on the 5th day, providing expert testimony about the broader implications of fraudulent psychiatric evaluation and the standards that should govern emergency mental health commitments. Dr. Rodriguez, what safeguards exist to prevent fraudulent psychiatric evaluation? Licensed psychiatrists are required to follow specific protocols, use validated assessment tools, and document their methodology extensively. None of these safeguards were followed in Ms. Patterson's case. What are the potential consequences of fraudulent psychiatric evaluation? Victims can lose their fundamental rights to make decisions about their own lives. They can be involuntarily committed, have their finances controlled by others, and suffer permanent damage to their credibility and reputation. In your opinion, What was the motivation for the fraudulent evaluation in this case? The evidence suggests that Ms. Patterson was targeted because she was asking questions about financial irregularities that threatened to expose criminal activity by her family member. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Financial experts testified about the missing money from my grandmother's accounts. Federal investigators detailed the broader criminal conspiracy that Cross had been operating. Victims of similar schemes testified about the devastating impact of fraudulent psychiatric evaluation on their lives. Rebecca, the woman I'd met at Cedar Hills, testified about her own experience with manufactured mental health crises designed to facilitate financial abuse. Ms. Thompson, how did your husband obtain a psychiatric evaluation that resulted in your commitment? He found a man who claimed to be a psychiatrist but wasn't licensed to practice. This man evaluated me for 30 minutes and declared that I was having a psychotic break because I wanted to leave my abusive marriage. What was the real reason for the evaluation? My husband wanted to gain custody of our children and control of our joint assets. Having me declared mentally incompetent was his way of ensuring I couldn't fight back through legal channels. How long were you involuntarily committed? 3 weeks, during which my husband convinced everyone that I was dangerous and unpredictable, while he moved our money into accounts I couldn't access. The pattern was consistent across all the victims' testimony. Vulnerable individuals had been targeted by family members who used fraudulent psychiatric evaluation to silence opposition to financial abuse. The criminal conspiracy had been sophisticated and systematic, with Cross and his network providing professional-looking documentation that legitimized what were essentially kidnappings and thefts. My parents' defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. Their attorneys attempted to argue that they'd been deceived by Cross's credentials, but the recordings made it clear that they'd known exactly what they were purchasing. They'd hired Cross to manufacture evidence of my mental incompetence, and they'd threatened to use that evidence to control my inheritance. On the 10th day of trial, something unexpected happened. My father collapsed during cross-examination, clutching his chest and gasping for air. The trial was suspended while he was transported to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed him with a massive heart attack brought on by the stress of facing life in prison. He died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The news hit me like a physical blow, even though our relationship had been destroyed by his criminal choices. Despite everything he'd done, despite his willingness to destroy my life to cover his crimes, he was still my father. The man who'd taught me to ride a bicycle, who'd attended my nursing school graduation, who'd walked me down the aisle at my wedding, but he was also the man who'd stolen from his dying mother and hired a fake psychiatrist to have his daughter declared insane. The grief I felt was complicated by anger, relief, and a profound sadness for the person he'd chosen to become. My mother's reaction to his death was devastating to witness. She seemed to collapse inward, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of loss and guilt. For the first time since this ordeal began, she looked like the vulnerable woman I remembered from my childhood. Ms. Patterson, the prosecutor approached me during the trial's suspension. Your mother's attorney is requesting a meeting. She wants to discuss a plea agreement. After all this time, your father's death appears to have broken through whatever psychological barriers were preventing her from acknowledging reality. She's finally ready to accept responsibility for her actions. I met with my mother in a conference room at the courthouse, the same sterile environment where we'd held our recorded conversation months earlier. She looked frail and defeated, wearing the black dress she'd worn to my father's funeral the previous day. "Chloe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry." The words I'd been waiting to hear for almost a year finally came, but they felt hollow and inadequate. Sorry couldn't restore the months of my life that had been consumed by criminal proceeding. Sorry couldn't repair the trust that had been shattered by her willingness to destroy my credibility. Sorry couldn't bring back the grandmother who died while her children stole from her accounts. I'm sorry too, Mom. Sorry that you chose to become someone I couldn't recognize. I need you to understand that we never intended for things to go this far. We thought we were protecting you from making mistakes that would hurt your future. You thought you were protecting $400,000 from the person who was legally entitled to inherit. We thought we were protecting you from yourself. Even in her moment of apparent contrition, My mother couldn't fully acknowledge the truth about what she'd done. She was sorry about the consequences, but she still believed her motivations had been pure. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you understand that what you did was wrong? She was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. I understand that I lost my daughter because I was too proud to admit I'd made terrible choices. That's not what I asked. I understand that I hurt you in ways that can never be repaired. Do you understand that you committed crimes against grandmother and against me? Another long pause. I understand that I let fear and pride turn me into someone I don't recognize. It was the closest she would come to acknowledging the truth. My mother would accept a plea bargain that sent her to prison for the rest of her life, but she would never fully admit that she'd been motivated by greed rather than love. I won't contest the plea agreement, but I also won't pretend that we can repair our relationship. You made choices that destroyed our family, and those choices have consequences that go beyond legal penalties. I know, she whispered. I know I've lost you forever. You lost me the moment you hired someone to declare me insane. My mother accepted a plea bargain that sentenced her to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. She would likely die in custody, an elderly woman who'd traded her freedom and her family for money that had already been spent on legal fees and restitution. The trial officially ended with her guilty plea, but the broader investigation continued. Cross's cooperation had exposed criminal networks in 12 states, leading to hundreds of arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets.
The case had become a landmark prosecution that changed how law enforcement approached financial abuse and fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. 6 months after my mother's sentencing, Marcus and I moved to a small house in southeast Portland, far from the Westfield Heights neighborhood where I'd grown up. The house was modest but filled with light, surrounded by a garden where we planted vegetables and flowers that would grow according to their own natural rhythms rather than artificial timelines imposed by human greed. I returned to work at Oregon Medical Center, where my colleagues had followed the case through media coverage and understood that I'd been a victim rather than a perpetrator. The experience had given me new insight into the vulnerability of patients and their families, and I found myself particularly drawn to advocacy work that protected people from institutional abuse. Marcus continued his practice, but he also began working with the state medical board to implement new safeguards against fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Elena Rodriguez had been promoted to chief of staff, and together they were developing training programs that would help legitimate mental health professionals identify and report suspected fraud. On the first anniversary of my grandmother's death, I visited her grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple granite engraved with her name and the dates of her birth and death, but someone had planted roses around the base that bloomed in defiant beauty despite the harsh circumstances. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," I said to the headstone, "but I made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else." The roses nodded in the breeze, and I imagined my grandmother's voice carried on the wind, telling me that I'd done exactly what she'd hoped I would do. She'd built protections into her will because she'd understood the people her children had become, and she'd trusted me to be strong enough to expose their crimes when the time came. As I drove home through Portland's familiar streets, I reflected on the year that had changed everything. I'd lost my family, but I'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that I could stand up to anyone who tried to destroy me, even the people who'd claimed to love me most. I'd learned that real love didn't require surrender of autonomy or acceptance of abuse disguised as protection. The criminal conspiracy that had targeted me had been dismantled, but the work of protecting vulnerable people from similar schemes continued. Every month brought new cases of financial abuse and fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, but now law enforcement had tools and training to identify and prosecute these crimes. I'd become an accidental advocate for systemic change, testifying before legislative committees and speaking at professional conferences about the intersection of mental health and financial abuse. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was meaningful work that honored my grandmother's memory and protected other families from the devastation mine had experienced. Marcus and I had grown closer through the ordeal, our relationship strengthened by the knowledge that we'd faced the worst possible circumstances together and emerged intact. We'd learned that love wasn't just about supporting each other through good times, but about standing together against people who would destroy you for their own benefit. On quiet evenings in our new home, we'd sit in the garden and watch the vegetables grow, marveling at the simple miracle of plants that thrived when given proper care and protection. It was a peaceful contrast to the years of manipulation and deception that had defined my relationship with my family of origin. Sometimes I wondered what my life would have been like if I'd never asked questions about my grandmother's medical expenses, if I'd simply accepted my parents' explanations and ignored the discrepancies that had launched this entire ordeal. I would have been richer but less free, surrounded by family but isolated by lies, secure in the illusion of love, but vulnerable to continued manipulation. The choice to fight back had cost me everything I'd thought I wanted, but it had given me everything I actually needed. I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, braver than I'd ever been required to be, and worthy of love that didn't come with conditions or expectations. My parents had tried to destroy me to protect their secrets, but they'd instead given me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that I could survive anything and emerge stronger on the other side. The criminal conspiracy that had targeted me had been dismantled, the vulnerable people it had victimized had been protected, and justice had been served in ways that honored both the living and the dead. As I watered our garden that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope and possibility, I realized that I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all my life, a home built on truth rather than lies, love offered freely rather than conditioned, and the peace that comes from knowing you've fought for what's right regardless of the personal cost. The roses my grandmother had loved bloomed in our garden now, transplanted from her estate before it was sold to pay restitution to other victims. They served as a daily reminder that beauty could grow from the ashes of destruction, that new life could emerge from the wreckage of old lies, and that some battles were worth fighting regardless of how much they cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.